Welcome to History in Ashes. You've just stepped into a place where the dust of the past still clings to the air, where stories unfold slowly, like the turning of old pages. Tonight, we set out to follow one of history's most extraordinary figures, Alexander the Great. A man who carved out an empire stretching across 3 continents, yet whose life ended before he reached the age of 33. In all of his campaigns, Alexander never lost a single battle. After his death, the empire that seemed eternal began disintegrating almost immediately, fought over by the very generals who once swore loyalty to him. Conquest, immortality, collapse, all woven into one brief, astonishing life. Before we go further, could you do me a small favor? Head down to the comments and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Maybe you're curled up at midnight or drifting after a long day. We'd love to know. And while you're down there, consider subscribing to History in Ashes. Think of it like joining Alexander's army, except you don't have to march thousands of miles, eat stale bread, or fight elephants. You just click a button and you're in. Not a bad trade, is it? Now, let's begin where all stories must begin, with a birth. The year was 356 before the Common Era. The place, a kingdom called Macedonia, not yet the dazzling empire it would become, but a rugged land in the northern fringes of Greece, known more for its fierce warriors and rough hills than for any great civilization. This was the soil that produced Alexander. He was born in the city of Pella, in a palace that looked more practical than splendid. Think less marble temples, more fortified stone and wooden beams. It was a kingdom on the edge, half Greek, half something else, looked down upon by the refined city-states of Athens and Thebes. Alexander's father was Philip II, a man of ambition who had already begun reshaping Macedonia into a power that the Greeks could no longer ignore. His mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus, a mountainous region filled with its own traditions, its own gods, and its own sense of destiny. Olympias was no ordinary queen. She was fiery, devout, and deeply superstitious, drawn to strange rites and mysteries. Later stories would say she slept with snakes in her bed as part of her religious practices. Whether true or just whispered slander, it gave her an aura of otherworldliness, and it gave Alexander a mother who believed he was destined for greatness beyond the ordinary. Even his birth was wrapped in omens. On the very night Alexander came into the world, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the great wonders of the ancient world, was said to have burned down. Ancient writers claimed that this was no coincidence. The goddess herself had abandoned her temple to be present at the birth of a man who would go on to conquer the known world. Was this poetic storytelling or a genuine belief of the time? Hard to say, but imagine living in a world where every fire, every shadow, every crack in the sky was a message from the gods. For those around Alexander, the message was clear: his life was touched by destiny. As a child, Alexander grew up in an environment shaped by both war and superstition. Macedonia was not a land of leisure or comfort. It was a place where survival meant strength. The hills were filled with tribes who resisted control, and Philip spent much of his reign fighting battles to secure Macedonia's borders. For young Alexander, this meant that from his earliest days, the sound of clashing weapons and the stories of military triumphs were not distant tales. They were his everyday backdrop. But it wasn't only war that shaped him. Olympias, ever convinced of his divine fate, whispered to him that he was no ordinary boy. According to her, he was descended from Achilles, the legendary hero of the Trojan War. She told him of Achilles' glory, his unmatched courage, and his tragic fate. These stories weren't just bedtime tales, they were scripts for how Alexander was expected to live, to be fearless, to pursue honor, to reach for something beyond the human. Imagine being a child, told again and again that your blood carried the spark of the greatest hero who ever lived. Would you start to believe it? Would it settle into your bones like a truth you could never shake? Another influence came from his father. Philip was not only a brilliant warrior, but a strategist who understood politics, alliances, and the importance of building power patiently. He had transformed Macedonia's ragged army into a disciplined force, inventing tactics like the long pike phalanx that would dominate battlefields for decades. Alexander watched his father not only win wars but also reshape how wars were fought. Yet there was tension too. Fathers and sons rarely see eye to eye, and when your father is a king who carves his own legend, the shadow he casts is enormous. Alexander grew up both admiring and resenting Philip, admiring his power, resenting that he himself would always be measured against it. As Alexander grew older, his education became another pillar of his destiny. Philip, ever ambitious, wanted his son to be more than a soldier. He hired the greatest mind of the age, Aristotle, to tutor him. Imagine being 13 years old and having Aristotle, the philosopher whose ideas would shape centuries, as your personal teacher. Under him, Alexander learned philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. He was exposed to Homer's epics, which only deepened his obsession with Achilles. Aristotle also planted in him the seeds of curiosity and interest in knowledge, in the workings of the world, in cultures beyond Greece. These lessons would later shape not only Alexander the Conqueror, but Alexander the builder of cities, the patron of ideas, the man who carried Greek culture across Asia. Yet childhood is never only books and lessons. Alexander was also tested physically. He had a restless spirit and a stubborn streak. A famous story tells of the day his father brought home a magnificent horse, Bucephalus. The animal was huge, wild, and unmanageable. No one could tame it. Alexander, still a boy, noticed that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned it toward the sun, so the shadow would fall behind, and suddenly, the horse calmed. Mounting it, he rode with ease. Philip, watching, was astonished. He is said to have told his son, "Macedonia is too small for you. Seek a kingdom equal to yourself." Whether the quote is real or embroidered over time, it captures something true. Even as a boy, Alexander's ambition was too large for the borders of his homeland. From omens at birth, to the whispers of a mother who saw divine destiny, to the lessons of Aristotle and the shadow of Philip, Alexander's early life was not ordinary. Every detail seemed to point forward, to a path that stretched beyond the horizon. But destiny is never as simple as it seems. Childhood dreams meet the hard edge of reality, and ambition must survive the weight of expectation. For Alexander, the question was not whether he would attempt greatness. The question was whether he could live up to the legend already written for him. What do you think? Does destiny shape a person's path? Or is it only the choices we make along the way that decide how far we go? If you picture Alexander as a child, it is easy to imagine only the warrior in the making, the boy who would someday lead armies across mountains and deserts. But in truth, his upbringing was as much about the mind as the sword. His father, Philip, had seen enough of war to know that armies win battles, but ideas shape kingdoms. So when Alexander reached the age of 13, Philip made a decision that would echo through history. He hired Aristotle to tutor his son. Not a local teacher, not a court scribe, but Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, student of Plato, heir to a tradition of thought that stretched back to Socrates. The arrangement itself says something about the world in which Alexander lived. Macedonia was still viewed by many Greeks as a rough, half-barbarian kingdom. The Athenians and Thebans sneered at Macedonians, mocking their accents, their rustic manners, their lack of refinement. By bringing Aristotle north to Pella, Philip was sending a message. Macedonia was not just a land of soldiers, but a land that could claim Greek culture in its highest form. And for Alexander, the impact was profound. Imagine being a boy, restless, proud, perhaps even arrogant, suddenly placed under the discipline of a man who measured the world with reason, logic, and relentless questioning. The lessons ranged across every subject. Aristotle taught him medicine, so Alexander would later walk among his soldiers in campaigns, prescribing treatments for wounds and fevers. He taught him zoology and botany, so Alexander developed a fascination for plants and animals he would encounter far beyond Greece. He taught him politics, instilling a belief that kingship was not simply power, but responsibility. Most of all, Aristotle taught him literature. Together, they read Homer's Iliad, not as a story but as a manual for life. Alexander became obsessed with Achilles, the hero whose glory was eternal but whose life was cut short. He is said to have carried a copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle on every campaign, keeping it under his pillow at night. For Alexander, Achilles was not a character in a poem, he was a mirror of what his own life should be. And yet, philosophy alone cannot tame a restless boy. Alexander was known for his temper. He could be quick to anger, sharp in pride, unwilling to yield. There are stories of him arguing fiercely with Aristotle, challenging even the great philosopher when he disagreed. But there are also signs of respect. Alexander absorbed Aristotle's habit of curiosity, of asking not only what was, but why. Later in life, when he pushed eastward into lands unknown to Greeks, he would send back reports of strange animals, plants, and customs, almost as though he was still answering his teacher's questions. The Conqueror was, in his own way, also a student. While Alexander studied, the wider world around him simmered. Greece, to the south, was fractured and unstable. The glory of the 5th century, when Athens had stood tall with its democracy and culture, had faded. The Peloponnesian War had left the Greek city-states weakened, suspicious of one another, and unable to unite. Thebes rose briefly in power, then stumbled. Sparta clung to its reputation, but lacked resources. Athens, proud as ever, still shone in culture, but was politically cautious. None of them could dominate the rest. Into this fractured landscape stepped Philip of Macedon, who, piece by piece, used war, diplomacy, and marriage to expand Macedonia's influence. For Alexander, this world of division was the backdrop to his youth. He was not raised in a stable, peaceful kingdom where he could simply dream. He grew up amid conspiracies, shifting alliances, and the constant presence of war. Even as he studied philosophy, he was also drilled in military training. He learned to ride, to fight, to endure hardship. He joined his father on campaigns, absorbing the discipline of soldiers and the strategies of generals. One telling moment came when Alexander was still a teenager. In the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip faced a coalition of Greek city-states led by Athens and Thebes. The Macedonian army, drilled into a fearsome phalanx, clashed with the proud hoplites of the south. On the battlefield that day, Alexander, barely 16, commanded the cavalry on the left wing. He did not simply hold his ground, he charged, breaking through the Theban sacred band, an elite force of 300 men bound by oath. The victory was decisive. The Greek world lay broken, and Macedonia now stood as master of Greece. For Alexander, it was the first taste of command, the first proof that he could not only learn but also act, not only follow but lead. But there is another side to this story, the domestic side, the palace intrigues. For all his brilliance, Philip was not a simple man. He took wives from across the regions, sealing alliances with marriages, and Olympia's, Alexander's mother, was only one of them. The household was a web of rivalries and jealousies. Alexander grew up watching his mother fiercely protect his claim, convinced that he was destined to inherit Philip's throne. Philip's other wives had their own children, their own ambitions. The result was a court filled with suspicion, whispers, and sudden outbursts of anger. For Alexander, it meant that from an early age, he understood power was never safe, never guaranteed. In this way, his childhood was a blend of contradictions, philosophy and warfare, lofty ideals and brutal politics, stories of Achilles and the reality of bloodshed. It shaped him into someone both idealistic and ruthless, someone who believed in destiny but never forgot the fragility of power. Think for a moment about what it means to be young in such a world, to sit in the sunlit courtyards of Pella, listening to Aristotle explain the principles of nature, and then, days later, to ride out beside your father to watch men kill and be killed, to hear your mother whisper that you were born of gods, and then to watch her rage against rivals who threatened her position, to be told that Achilles was your model, but also to see your father building his own empire in ways Achilles never could, through patience, politics, and strategy. How does a boy reconcile all of this? Does he dream of becoming a hero like Achilles? Or does he envy the cold efficiency of Philip? Perhaps, in Alexander's case, the answer was both. This balance between idealism and reality would define him. When he conquered, he spoke of spreading Greek culture, of uniting East and West, of creating something larger than any one nation. And yet, the methods were often brutal: cities destroyed, populations enslaved, rebellions crushed without mercy. In his youth, you can already see the seeds of both the dreamer and the destroyer. And then there was the ever-present question of succession. Even as Alexander grew older, Philip's ambitions expanded. He planned to launch an invasion of the Persian Empire, the vast, glittering realm that stretched from Anatolia to India. For Philip, it was the next step in proving Macedonia's greatness. But where would Alexander stand in all this? As heir, or as rival? As partner in glory, or as obstacle to Philip's own plans? For now, Alexander remained the son, the student, the young commander, but history was already turning. The Greek world had been subdued, Macedonia stood ascendant, and Persia waited across the sea. All the while, within the palace walls, tension simmered. Destiny was approaching, but it would arrive in ways no one could predict. Do you think Alexander, at 16, already sensed that his life would not be confined to Macedonia, or was he still just a boy trying to live up to the shadows of Achilles, Aristotle, and Philip? When you think of Alexander, it is easy to see him as a figure who burst suddenly onto the stage of history, unstoppable and destined for greatness. But the truth is that no conqueror rises alone. Behind Alexander stood his father, Philip II of Macedon, a man whose shadow stretched long across his son's youth. Without Philip, there would have been no Alexander as we know him. The empire Alexander carved was built upon the foundations Philip had already laid, stone by stone, campaign by campaign, reform by reform. Philip was not born a king. He was the youngest son of a Macedonian royal family that was anything but stable. The Macedonian monarchy was hereditary, but it was also precarious. Succession was never smooth, and rival branches of the royal family often fought for power. When Philip was young, Macedonia itself was weak, threatened by enemies on all sides. Illyrians raided from the west, Thracians pressed from the north, and the Greek city-states to the south mocked and dismissed Macedonia as a rough, semi-barbarian kingdom. It seemed unlikely that this fractured land would produce a dynasty that would dominate Greece, let alone challenge Persia. But Philip was no ordinary prince. In his youth, he spent time as a hostage in Thebes, one of the leading Greek powers of the era. What could have been humiliation turned into education. In Thebes, Philip observed the famed Theban generals Epaminondas and Pelopidas, who had shattered Sparta's dominance with clever tactics and disciplined troops. He watched the sacred band, that elite corps of 300 soldiers bound by personal bonds, fight with skill and unity. Philip absorbed these lessons, not as abstract theories but as practical tools. When he returned to Macedonia, he carried in his mind the seeds of transformation. His chance came in the year 359 before the Common Era, when Philip, still young, seized power after a series of royal assassinations and disasters left the throne vulnerable. At first, he was only a regent, ruling on behalf of a nephew. But Philip was shrewd, and in the chaos of invasions and unrest, he consolidated power for himself. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Philip was king in more than name. The Macedonia he inherited was fragile. The army was poorly organized, little more than armed farmers. The treasury was thin, enemies pressed on every side. Yet this was the moment when Philip revealed his genius. He reformed the army from the ground up, creating a force that would become the model for Alexander's conquests. Instead of the traditional hoplite spear of 8 feet, he armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike up to 18 feet long. Held in tight formation, these spears created a wall of points, a porcupine of death that could pierce enemy lines. The Macedonian phalanx was drilled relentlessly, learning to move as a single body, flexible yet impenetrable. Philip combined this with cavalry, archers, and light infantry, creating an army that was not only strong but adaptable. But Philip's genius was not limited to the battlefield. He was a politician of the First Order. He used marriages as weapons, forging alliances by wedding women from powerful families across the Balkans and Greece. He bribed, threatened, and negotiated with city-states, weakening them from within even as he defeated them from without. Slowly, relentlessly, he expanded Macedonia's reach. For Alexander, growing up in this environment was like being raised in a forge. Every year brought new campaigns, new conquests, new enemies subdued. Philip defeated the Illyrians, secured the northern frontiers, and pushed south into Thessaly. Each victory strengthened Macedonia, and each victory deepened Alexander's sense that power was not only possible but inevitable. Yet Philip's rise was not just about war. He also transformed Macedonia itself. He built roads and fortifications, reorganized the economy, and secured access to silver and gold mines that funded his campaigns. Pella, once a modest capital, grew into a center of wealth and intrigue. Foreign envoys arrived, not to scoff, but to seek favor. The once scorned Macedonians now demanded respect. The decisive moment came in 338 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Chaeronea. Athens and Thebes, alarmed by Philip's growing power, set aside their rivalries and formed an alliance to stop him. For Greece, it was one last attempt to preserve independence. For Philip, it was the culmination of years of preparation. On that battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx met the proud hoplites of Athens and the sacred band of Thebes. The clash was brutal, the outcome uncertain, but Philip's army proved superior. At a key moment, Alexander, then only 18, led the cavalry charge that broke the sacred band. The Greek alliance collapsed. Greece lay open before Macedonia. After Chaeronea, Philip created the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states bound under Macedonian leadership. On paper, it was a league of allies. In reality, it was Philip's tool of control. For the first time, the Greeks were united not by their own choice, but by the dominance of Macedonia. And then, Philip turned his eyes eastward. Persia loomed across the Aegean Sea, vast and wealthy. The empire that had once invaded Greece with hundreds of thousands of troops under Xerxes. Now weakened by internal strife, Persia was ripe for conquest. Philip began preparations for a grand invasion, not just as a raid but as a campaign to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and perhaps dismantle Persia itself. This was the stage he built for Alexander, the vision of a Macedonian-led crusade against Persia, a blending of revenge and ambition. But Philip's brilliance was matched by his flaws. He was ruthless, ambitious, and prone to arrogance. His many marriages bred resentment and jealousy in his court. Olympias, Alexander's mother, felt betrayed when Philip took a new wife from a powerful Macedonian family, threatening Alexander's position as heir. The palace became a nest of rivalries, whispers of plots, and simmering hatred. Alexander, caught between admiration for his father and loyalty to his mother, found himself in an impossible position. The tension came to a head in 336 before the Common Era. Philip was celebrating the marriage of his daughter in Aigai, the old capital of Macedonia. Dignitaries from across Greece attended, a display of Philip's triumph. But in the midst of the procession, as Philip entered the theatre, he was struck down by one of his own bodyguards. The king who had united Greece, who had built the army, who had dreamed of Persia, lay dead in a pool of blood. For Alexander, the moment was shattering. He was only 20 years old, suddenly thrust onto the throne of a kingdom, with enemies on every side, allies uncertain, and a father's colossal shadow hanging over him. Yet it was also the moment destiny demanded. All the omens, all the lessons, all the battles had prepared him for this. Now the question was whether he could hold what Philip had built, or even surpass it. Think of it this way. Without Philip, Alexander would have inherited nothing but a fragile kingdom and endless threats. With Philip, he inherited a disciplined army, a unified Greece, and a vision of Persia waiting across the sea. But he also inherited rivals, enemies, and expectations almost impossible to meet. So the question lingers, did Alexander succeed because of his father's foundation, or did he succeed in spite of it? The death of Philip II was not simply the loss of a king, it was the collapse of the order he had so carefully built. Imagine the scene. The festival at Aegae in 336 before the Common Era. Macedonians and Greeks gathered to celebrate the marriage of Philip's daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Olympias' own brother. It was meant to be a triumphal display, Philip at the height of his power, Greece firmly under his control, Persia in his sights. The theatre filled with dignitaries. Statues of the 12 Olympian gods had been set up, but Philip had dared to add one more of himself, as the 13th. To some, this was a sign of arrogance, even hubris. To others, a simple reflection of the power he wielded. As Philip entered, dressed not in armor but in ceremonial robes, he was exposed, flanked by little more than his bodyguards. And then, in a moment of stunning violence, one of those guards, Pausanias, lunged forward and drove a blade into the king's side. The crowd erupted in chaos. Philip collapsed, lifeless, his blood staining the ground of Aegae. Why did Pausanias strike? Ancient sources disagree. Some claimed it was personal vengeance. Pausanias had been wronged and humiliated by others at court, and Philip had failed to protect him. Others whispered of conspiracy, that Olympias, furious at being displaced by Philip's new wife, had encouraged the deed. Still others suspected Persia, eager to remove the man preparing to invade them. The truth may never be known. But what mattered most was that Philip was dead, and the world he had built stood on the edge of collapse. For Alexander, 20 years old, the moment was perilous. Power never passes smoothly, especially in Macedonia. The kingdom had never been a place where succession was guaranteed. Rival branches of the royal family circled like vultures, waiting for weakness. The Greek city-states, recently subdued, saw their chance to break free. The Thracians, Illyrians, and other tribes along Macedonia's borders stirred restlessly. Even within the Macedonian court, generals who had been loyal to Philip might not bow easily to a young and untested king. Alexander moved quickly, decisively, with a speed that shocked both allies and enemies. Within hours of Philip's death, he secured the loyalty of the Macedonian army, the one institution that could make or break a king. He was proclaimed king by the soldiers, their shouts ringing out in the theatre where Philip had fallen. The generals, many of whom had fought alongside Philip for years, accepted Alexander but not without hesitation. To secure his throne, Alexander had to act ruthlessly. One of his first moves was to eliminate rivals. Members of Philip's new wife's family, including her child who might have challenged Alexander's legitimacy, were executed. Supporters of rival claimants were purged. Olympias, always fierce in her loyalty to her son, took a leading role, ensuring no threats remained within the court. It was brutal, but necessary. In Macedonia, mercy was often weakness, and weakness meant death. With the palace secured, Alexander turned to the wider kingdom. News of Philip's death spread quickly, and rebellions flared almost immediately. The Thracians and Illyrians on Macedonia's northern borders rose up. In Greece, Thebes and Athens whispered of throwing off Macedonian dominance. Even within the League of Corinth, the alliance Philip had forged, cracks appeared. All of Greece was watching, wondering, could this boy king hold the empire together? Alexander wasted no time answering. He marched north to deal with the tribes along the borders, crushing them swiftly. His campaign was not just about defeating enemies, but about sending a message. The throne of Macedonia was not vacant, and the son of Philip was no less dangerous than the father. Victories piled up quickly, silencing those who doubted. Then came Greece. Thebes, always proud, tested him first. Rumors spread that Alexander had died in the north, and Thebes rose in rebellion. convinced they could cast off Macedonian control. When Alexander marched south, it was with terrifying speed. He covered hundreds of miles in little more than 2 weeks, his army moving like a storm. The Thebans were stunned to see him appear before their walls, very much alive. What followed was one of the most infamous acts of Alexander's early reign. Thebes resisted, hoping Athens and other cities would join them. But Alexander acted swiftly and without mercy. The city was stormed, its defenders slaughtered, its buildings torn down. According to accounts, 6,000 Thebans were killed, and 30,000 more were sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The destruction of Thebes sent a clear, chilling message to the rest of Greece. Rebellion would mean annihilation. Athens, faced with the same choice, backed down. The other Greek states, shocked by Thebes' fate, submitted. The League of Corinth was reaffirmed, and Alexander was recognized as its leader, inheriting not only Philip's throne, but also his position as commander of the Greek world. The boy had become king, and the king had become master of Greece. But beneath the triumph lay deeper questions. Was Alexander already envisioning the vast conquests to come, or was he simply trying to survive, to hold together what his father had left him? Some sources suggest he immediately adopted Philip's plans to invade Persia. Others hint that he had to be convinced, that his first concern was to stabilize Macedonia before taking on an empire many times its size. Either way, within just a year of Philip's death, Alexander had secured his throne, crushed rebellions, and positioned himself as the leader of a united Greece. Consider how extraordinary this was. Most kingdoms, after the sudden assassination of their ruler, crumble into civil war. Most young heirs, untested and surrounded by rivals, are swept aside. Alexander not only survived but expanded his authority, and he did so at an age when most men were only beginning their adult lives. The stage was set. With Greece subdued, with Macedonia secure, with enemies silenced, Alexander could now turn his gaze outward. Across the sea, Persia loomed, the ancient empire that had humbled Greece, that stretched from Anatolia to Egypt, from Babylon to India. For decades, the Greeks had dreamed of revenge against Persia. Philip had prepared the invasion. Now his son would carry it out. But before he set sail, Alexander had proven something more personal. He had shown that he was not merely his father's son, not merely a shadow living in the glow of Philip's legacy. He had shown that he could act with a ruthlessness, a speed, and a daring that were entirely his own. What do you think mattered more in those first years? Alexander's ability to inspire loyalty, or his willingness to use fear and brutality when loyalty wavered? You are now standing with Alexander not in the wide-open plains of Asia, but in the familiar land of Greece, a place that was at once united under his father's legacy, and yet constantly threatening to break apart. Imagine a map of the Greek world. Athens, Thebes, Sparta, Corinth, all proud, all suspicious, and all deeply uncomfortable, with Macedon sitting at the top. When Philip was alive, his strength kept them in line. But when word spread of his assassination, the whispers began to fill the air. Cities that had once bowed reluctantly started asking one another, perhaps Macedon's grip has weakened, perhaps the boy cannot hold the throne, perhaps freedom is within reach. It is one thing to inherit an empire, it is another to keep it from unraveling in your hands. For Alexander, the test came almost immediately. Athens muttered about independence. Thebes began to stir. Sparta, forever hostile, waited for its moment. You can picture the conversations in smoky chambers, with city elders asking, what do we owe this young man from the north? Why should we bend the knee to a Macedonian teenager? Surely now is the time to rise. Alexander's response was swift, and it tells you something important about him. He understood that hesitation was poison. If even a single Greek city managed to throw off Macedon's rule, others would follow like dominoes. So he gathered his army, the hardened men who had once followed his father, and began marching south with determination. He needed to send a message, not through words, but through action. When he reached Thebes, The rebellion there was already well underway. Thebes, proud and stubborn, believed it could ignite a fire that would consume Macedon's hold over Greece. It is easy to imagine the confidence of the Theban leaders. They had stood against Persia long ago at Thermopylae. They had fought Athens. They had survived countless wars. Why should they fear this boy? Perhaps they thought his men would falter, or that Athens might come to their aid. Perhaps they thought Macedon's strength was just an illusion. But they underestimated Alexander. He encircled the city and prepared for an assault. Here is where the story turns grim. Thebes resisted with bravery, but Alexander's army broke through. What followed was a destruction so complete that it shocked the entire Greek world. Thousands were killed, the city walls torn down, houses burned, and the population enslaved. Thebes was erased, almost as if it had never existed. It might sound brutal, and it was but to Alexander. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a lesson carved into stone and ash. He was showing every other Greek city what rebellion would cost, and it worked. When Athens saw what had happened to Thebes, their fiery talk of independence suddenly cooled. Sparta remained hostile but lacked the strength to act. The rest of Greece bowed once more. For the ordinary people of Thebes, though, the cost was unbearable. Imagine being a farmer or a craftsman, watching not just your home but your entire city vanish in a matter of days. One moment, you are part of a proud polis. The next, you are homeless, enslaved, or wandering. To history, this is strategy. To those who lived it, it was devastation. Yet in this devastation, Alexander secured the foundation for everything that would come next. Greece would remain quiet while he turned his gaze toward Asia. Without this iron grip at home, he could never have dared to cross the Hellespont. But with Thebes in ruins and Athens subdued, his rear was safe. He had shown the world, and perhaps himself, that he was not just Philip's son, he was a ruler in his own right. And so, with Greece silenced and his authority confirmed, Alexander began to look east, across the waters, toward the vast empire of Persia. But what must it have felt like in the quiet of the night after Thebes burned? Did he reflect on the weight of what he had done, or did he see only the necessity of it? Can a man who aims at conquering the world afford to dwell on the suffering he causes, or must he harden himself to it? Picture the narrow stretch of water called the Hellespont, the strait that separates Europe from Asia. On one side stands Alexander, the young king of Macedon, leading an army of barely 40 men. On the other side lies the vast Persian Empire, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the far reaches of India, a world so enormous that to conquer it seems like chasing the horizon itself. And yet, Alexander does not hesitate. He makes the crossing, not just as a military maneuver, but as a symbolic act. According to ancient writers, when he reached the Asian shore, he leapt from his ship, threw his spear into the soil, and claimed the land as a gift of war. You can almost see the gesture, dramatic, theatrical, a declaration to his men and to history itself that this was no mere raid. He had come not just to challenge Persia, but to take it. The scale of what he faced, however, was staggering. Persia was wealthy beyond measure, a giant with cities larger and richer than anything in Greece, an empire that had ruled for centuries. His own army, while disciplined and loyal, was small by comparison. Many of his soldiers must have looked across that sea and wondered if they were marching to glory or to their graves. The first great test came quickly, at the Battle of the Granicus River. Imagine a clear spring day in Asia Minor, the river running fast and cold, the Persian satraps, governors, gathering their cavalry and infantry to block Alexander's advance. The Persians thought they had chosen the perfect ground. The river, with its steep banks, would make it nearly impossible for Macedonian troops to cross in formation. They believed they could crush Alexander at the water's edge before he even set foot on Persian soil proper. But Alexander, as always, chose audacity. Instead of waiting, instead of trying to find another crossing, he ordered his men straight into the river. You can imagine the scene, the clatter of hooves as cavalry plunged into the water, shields lifted against a hail of arrows, men slipping and splashing, climbing the far bank while Persian riders charged down on them. It must have seemed madness. And yet, somehow, the Macedonian phalanx and cavalry held together, surging up onto the opposite shore. At the heart of the fight was Alexander himself, leading the charge in person. Accounts tell us that he drove into the thickest fighting, his bright plumed helmet marking him out. At one point, a Persian noble raised his sword to strike him down, only for Alexander's comrade Clytus the Black to cut the man down just in time, saving the young king's life. Victory was not just won by strategy here, it was won by the reckless bravery that Alexander demanded of himself as much as of his men. When the battle was over, the Persians fled, leaving the field to Alexander. The road into Asia Minor was open. Cities began to surrender to him, either out of fear or in hopes of gaining his favor. Some welcomed him as a liberator, especially the Greek cities that had long been under Persian rule. Others resisted and were treated harshly. For Alexander, the campaign was not just about defeating armies. It was about shaping an image of a conqueror who could not be stopped. But pause for a moment and think about what this meant for his men. Many of them had grown up hearing stories of the Persian wars, the days when their grandfathers had fought at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. Persia had been the great enemy, the looming power that once threatened to crush Greece. And now, they were not only defending their homeland but marching into the enemy's heartland. It must have felt like stepping into legend, as if they were writing the next chapter of the stories told around every Greek hearth. Yet this was only the beginning. The Persian king, Darius III, had not yet appeared on the battlefield. The fight at the Granicus was only against local governors, not the full might of Persia. Alexander knew that much larger storms were coming. Still, the victory mattered. It told his men that Persia could be beaten, that their cause was not hopeless. It gave them confidence, and it gave Alexander momentum. And so, with the Granicus behind him, Alexander pressed on deeper into Asia Minor, city by city, stronghold by stronghold. Ahead of him lay a confrontation that would shake the balance of the ancient world, a clash not just of armies, but of empires, with Darius himself finally stepping into the story. By now, Alexander's campaign had rolled steadily through Asia Minor. Cities fell one after another, some by surrender, others by siege. But Persia was far from beaten. Word finally came. King Darius III, the great king of Persia, was marching in person at the head of a massive army to crush this young upstart who dared to invade his empire. For Alexander's men, this was the moment they had half dreaded, half anticipated. No longer would they be facing local satraps or scattered resistance. This was the king himself, with the full prestige of Persia behind him. Ancient sources claim Darius's army numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though historians today suggest it was far smaller, perhaps closer to 100. Still, compared to Alexander's 40, it was a daunting, seemingly impossible mismatch. The stage for their meeting was the narrow coastal plain near a small river called the Pinarus, close to the town of Issus in modern-day Turkey. Picture the scene, the Mediterranean Sea glittering on one side, mountains looming on the other. The plain was so narrow that the vast Persian army could not deploy to its full advantage. Instead of a wide open field where sheer numbers could overwhelm, the terrain squeezed the armies into a confined space. And in that tight bottleneck, discipline and strategy could matter more than numbers. When the two forces drew up, the difference must have been overwhelming to behold. On one side, Persian ranks stretched as far as the eye could see, rows of infantry, clouds of archers, chariots ready to charge, cavalry glittering with armor. On the other side stood Alexander's compact army, their sarissas, the long spears of the phalanx, bristling in precise formation, their eyes fixed on their young king, who rode at the head of the companion cavalry. The battle began with Alexander doing what he always did, taking the offensive. While his phalanx locked the Persian infantry in place, he personally led a thunderous charge with his cavalry against the Persian left. Imagine the pounding of hooves, the clash of spear against shield, the cries of men locked in desperate struggle. Alexander himself plunged into the thick of the fight, his presence electrifying his troops and terrifying his enemies. Meanwhile, in the Persian center, the fight was brutal. The Macedonian phalanx struggled against the sheer press of numbers. Shields clashed, men fell, the line bent dangerously. For a moment, it seemed the Persians might break through, but Alexander's daring maneuver on the flank tipped the balance. His cavalry punched through the Persian lines, and suddenly he was racing toward the center, racing directly at Darius himself. This is the moment ancient writers linger on. Darius, the great king of Persia, watching as Alexander's charge bore down on him. For all his numbers, for all his splendor, the young Macedonian king was suddenly at his doorstep, and then it happened. Panic seized Darius. He turned his chariot and fled the field. His soldiers, seeing their king retreat, began to break as well. What had been an enormous Persian army dissolved into chaos. The rout was devastating. Thousands of Persians were cut down as they fled. Even more importantly, Darius's own family, his wife, his mother, his children, were captured by Alexander's men. To the Persians, this was unthinkable. To Alexander, it was both a triumph and an opportunity. He treated Darius's family with unexpected respect, refusing to harm them and even assuring them that they would be honored as royalty. It was a calculated gesture, designed to show himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a king worthy of ruling over Persia itself. For his men, the victory at Issus was almost unbelievable. They had faced the great king in person and forced him to flee. It must have felt as though the gods themselves were on their side. For Alexander, it was confirmation that his destiny stretched far beyond Macedonia. But while Darius had lost the battle, he had not lost the war. He still had vast resources, still commanded enormous armies, still held the heart of the empire. The showdown at Issus was dramatic, but it was only round one. Greater clashes lay ahead, on even grander stages. And as Alexander turned southward after the victory, he began one of the most difficult and famous parts of his campaign, not against armies, but against cities. Ahead lay the legendary siege of Tyre, a battle not of cavalry and phalanx, but of patience, ingenuity, and sheer determination. After Issus, Alexander had done the unthinkable. He had beaten the great king himself. Yet instead of chasing Darius immediately eastward, Alexander turned south. Why? Because to control the Persian Empire, he first needed to control the sea. And the sea was ruled not by armies, but by cities, wealthy, fortified ports that dotted the Mediterranean coast. Among them, one stood above all: Tyre. Tyre was no ordinary city. It was a jewel of the Phoenician world, fabulously wealthy from trade, and nearly impregnable. Most importantly, it was an island city, sitting about half a mile offshore, its walls rising sheer from the sea, 150 feet high in places. From those walls, the Tyrians could look out at any would-be invader and laugh. No siege engines could be rolled up to those fortifications. No army could simply storm the gates. The only way to take Tyre was by sea, and Tyre's fleet was second to none. When Alexander demanded entry to the city so he could sacrifice to Heracles, whom the Greeks associated with Tyre's patron god, Melkart, the Tyrians refused. They were polite but firm. No Macedonian would step foot inside their island sanctuary. Alexander's answer was simple and audacious: "I will build a road to you." And so began one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient history. Alexander ordered his men to construct a massive mole, a causeway of stone, timber, and rubble, stretching out from the mainland to the island city. Imagine it: thousands of soldiers, laborers, and engineers hauling stones, sinking timbers, filling the sea with earth slowly, painfully extending land where none had been. At first, the Tyrians must have laughed. Surely this was madness. But day by day, the mole crept closer. The Tyrians fought back with everything they had. From their ships, they rained missiles down on the workers. Divers swam out to sabotage the foundations. They launched fire ships, vessels packed with pitch and oil, set ablaze, and driven into Alexander's siege towers, sending them up in flames. More than once, the Macedonians had to watch helplessly as weeks of work were destroyed in an instant. But Alexander would not give up. He rebuilt, reinforced, and adapted. Most importantly, he gathered a fleet. From the ports he had already taken Sidon, Byblos, and others, he demanded ships. Slowly, he assembled a navy powerful enough to challenge Tyre at sea. With both land and sea blockades in place, the city began to feel the pressure. After 7 grueling months, Alexander was ready for the final assault. His engineers had built enormous siege towers and mounted catapults on ships. His men rode into the assault under a hail of arrows and stones. Battering rams hammered at the walls, while others scaled ladders under desperate resistance. The fighting was savage, hand to hand, as Macedonians clawed their way up the walls while Tyrians hurled them back with stones, spears, and boiling sand. At last, a breach was made. Alexander himself, as always, was in the thick of it, storming the walls with his men. Once the Macedonians gained a foothold, the city's fate was sealed. The defenders were overwhelmed, and Tyre fell. The aftermath was brutal. Ancient accounts tell us that thousands were killed in the fighting, and thousands more, perhaps as many as 30, were sold into slavery. Alexander was merciless, both as a warning to other cities and as revenge for the months of resistance. Yet the symbolic victory was enormous. The strongest city of the Phoenicians, the naval backbone of Persia, had been crushed. For Alexander, the fall of Tyre was more than just a military conquest. It was proof to his men, to the Persians, to the world that no obstacle was too great, no fortress too strong. He had taken the unconquerable city by sheer willpower and ingenuity. From Tyre, Alexander turned south again, toward Egypt. There, he would be welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, and proclaimed something far greater than a king. You have followed Alexander across the burning plains of Asia Minor, through rivers of steel and blood, and watched him defy the Persian kings. And now, the campaign shifts, moving south into lands where the Nile weaves its life-giving ribbon through a desert both unforgiving and beautiful. Egypt lies ahead, a kingdom steeped in millennia of history, a place of towering monuments, endless sands, and gods whose names resonate like echoes across the ages. For centuries, Egypt had endured foreign rulers, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and for the people of this land, foreign kings were a burden, not a blessing. When Alexander approached in 332 before the Common Era, the Egyptians had been under Persian rule for decades. The Persian satrap, Macedonia, held the province with what might have seemed like firm control, but in truth, Persia's grip was brittle. The empire had been shaken at Issus, and its navy had been crippled at Tyre. Alexander's reputation preceded him. The stories of the young Macedonian king, undefeated and unstoppable, reached the ears of local governors and priests alike. The Egyptians, long accustomed to foreign overlords, saw in him not just a conqueror, but a liberator. Alexander did not march straight into battle. There was no pitched fight, no prolonged siege. The Persian satrap, recognizing the inevitability of the Macedonian advance, surrendered Pelusium and other border towns almost without resistance. It was an unusual welcome for a man who had taken cities with fire and sword, and it allowed Alexander to enter Egypt in relative peace. Yet peace in Egypt was not passive. It was a delicate performance, a negotiation of perception, legitimacy, and divine authority. From the very beginning, Alexander understood the power of symbolism. To the Egyptians, he was not merely a foreign king, he was a man who respected their traditions and gods. Upon reaching Memphis, the ancient capital, he performed sacrifices to Ptah, the creator god, and to other deities central to the religious life of Egypt. He did not merely obey tradition, he elevated it, becoming part of the sacred order of rulers that had guided Egypt for millennia. When he was crowned pharaoh, the priests placed upon his head the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, signaling not just authority, but cosmic legitimacy. In a single gesture, Alexander transformed from a Macedonian warrior to a divinely sanctioned ruler in the eyes of the Egyptians. But Alexander was not content with mere ceremonial triumphs. He knew that legitimacy alone could not hold a kingdom as vast and complex as Egypt. So he undertook a journey few could imagine, a trek that combined devotion, ambition, and perhaps a touch of the mystical. He set out for the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis, deep in the western desert. The journey was treacherous, with endless sand stretching under a punishing sun, and only a small party could accompany him. Supplies were limited, the desert offered no shelter, and water was scarce. Yet Alexander pressed on, driven by a desire for confirmation, for the sense that the gods themselves sanctioned his rule and the empire he intended to build. The Siwa oasis, isolated and secretive, lay in a depression far from the Nile. Few outsiders ever reached it, and even fewer survived the journey without becoming lost or succumbing to the heat. Alexander's arrival at the sanctuary was the stuff of legend. The priests, sworn to protect the oracle's secrets, greeted him with solemn ceremony. According to the accounts preserved by historians, the oracle spoke to Alexander in a voice that was both commanding and inscrutable, declaring him the son of Zeus Ammon, a god-king in human form. Though the exact words remain a mystery, the declaration would resonate for the rest of his life. Alexander left Siwa not merely as a king or conqueror, but as a man whose authority was framed by the divine. For Alexander's soldiers, the journey to Egypt and the visit to Siwa must have seemed almost unreal. They had followed him across rivers and mountains, through battles against overwhelming odds, and now they watched their leader move among gods and priests, recognized as a divine ruler. The story of Alexander as the son of Zeus Ammon would spread quickly, giving his men not only inspiration but a psychological edge. A king sanctioned by the gods is more than a general, he is a force of destiny itself. Egypt, however, was not merely a land to be ruled, it was a land to be transformed. Alexander looked beyond the immediate victories and began thinking in terms of lasting influence. Near the mouth of the Nile, he envisioned a city that would serve as a hub for Greek culture and trade, a bridge between Egypt, Greece, and the wider world. This city, which he named Alexandria, would grow into one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. Its harbors would welcome ships from across the Mediterranean, its streets would echo with multiple languages, and its libraries would preserve knowledge for centuries. Even at this early stage, Alexander's vision extended far beyond conquest. He sought to create civilization as much as he sought to win battles. The founding of Alexandria was also strategic. By establishing a Greek city in the heart of Egypt, Alexander ensured a permanent presence for Macedonian culture and influence, even as he planned to move eastward again. It was a gesture of permanence, a statement that his campaign was not merely temporary raiding but a long-term transformation of the ancient world. Yet Alexander was also pragmatic. Egypt's wealth, its agricultural abundance, and its strategic location were assets he would need for the next phase of his campaign. The confrontation with Darius, who had retreated after Issus, regrouping and preparing for a decisive showdown. Alexander had secured the Nile Valley, not through destruction, but through diplomacy, ceremony, and the careful display of respect for local customs. In doing so, he created loyalty and stability, turning Egypt into a base from which he could launch the next leg of his conquests. Imagine the Nile at that time, wide, fertile, and life-giving, lined with temples and villages, carrying trade along its waters. Alexander's men, seasoned by battle and death, would have marveled at the abundance and tranquility, a sharp contrast to the deserts and sieges they had endured. For a brief moment, Egypt offered them a reprieve, a place of wealth, culture, and divine legitimacy. Yet even in this respite, Alexander's mind was elsewhere. The Persian Empire still stood, and Darius remained a looming figure of challenge. Alexander's actions in Egypt highlight a critical aspect of his leadership. He understood that conquest alone is fleeting. To rule, he needed to integrate, to respect, and to impress. By embracing Egyptian religion, founding cities, and demonstrating his divine sanction, he bound the land to his cause more effectively than brute force alone could. And in doing so, he demonstrated a vision of empire that combined military genius with cultural strategy, a pattern that would repeat across the lands he would conquer in the years to come. Thus, when Alexander finally left Egypt, he carried not only the riches of the land and the loyalty of its people, but also the aura of divinity. His claim as son of Zeus, Ammon, and Pharaoh of Egypt enhanced his stature across the known world. He had turned a peaceful surrender into a symbolic and strategic victory, a foundation that would sustain his campaigns across Persia and beyond. Even now, as you imagine Alexander leaving Egypt, one cannot help but wonder, did he see himself as a god walking among men, or merely a mortal attempting to command the impossible? The answer is elusive, but the consequences of his time in Egypt would echo through history for centuries. From the crowning at Memphis to the sands of Siwa, from the streets of Alexandria to the Nile's eternal flow, Alexander left a mark that was as much cultural and religious as it was military. And so, by the end of his Egyptian campaign, Alexander had achieved something remarkable. He had turned a conquered land into a loyal province, transformed a distant kingdom into a spiritual affirmation of his divine right, and established a city that would endure far beyond his lifetime. He was no longer merely the boy king of Macedonia. He was a pharaoh, a god king, and the orchestrator of a vision that would span continents. The question lingers: in conquering Egypt so swiftly and wisely, did Alexander demonstrate that the true art of empire lies as much in persuasion and culture as in battle? Or was it simply a prelude to the even greater challenges he would face east of the Nile, where the Persian heartland awaited, and where the next clash would decide the fate of civilizations? With Egypt secure behind him, Alexander turned his gaze eastward, toward the heart of the Persian Empire. The Nile, with its life-giving waters and rich cities, had offered a brief reprieve, a place to consolidate power and plan. But the ultimate prize awaited beyond the deserts and mountains, the lands of Mesopotamia, Babylon, and the capital of Persia itself. Darius III had survived the Battle of Issus, regrouped, and was preparing to confront Alexander once more. This time, the stakes were nothing less than the fate of empires. The march from Egypt into Mesopotamia was arduous. The army, though experienced and battle-hardened, had to traverse the Sinai, the deserts, and the narrow passes of the Levant. Supplies were stretched thin, water scarce, and the heat merciless. Yet Alexander moved with remarkable speed and organization. Every night the camp was secured, scouts were sent ahead, and supply lines were meticulously maintained. This was not mere marching. It was a logistical feat, a testament to the discipline of his forces and the genius of their commander. Along the way, cities and towns fell in submission. Some opened their gates without resistance, impressed or terrified by Alexander's record. Others were punished for defiance. Though by now Alexander had refined his approach, he combined diplomacy with displays of force. To those who welcomed him, he offered mercy and patronage. To those who resisted, he offered swift and decisive consequences. By the time he reached the plains of Mesopotamia, Alexander's army was both physically strong and psychologically emboldened. They had fought against the Persian armies, crossed deserts, survived sieges, and witnessed their king's audacity firsthand. The two armies met at Gaugamela, near the Tigris River, in 331 before the Common Era. The choice of battlefield was deliberate on Darius's part. He selected a vast, open plain, flat and unobstructed, suitable for his numerically superior army. According to ancient accounts, Darius commanded as many as 200,000 men, though historians today estimate the number closer to 100,000. They included infantry, cavalry, scythed chariots, and archers, all arrayed in disciplined formations. Alexander's army numbered perhaps 40,000, half the size of the Persian force. On paper, the Macedonians were outmatched, outflanked, and vulnerable, yet Alexander had prepared. He surveyed the plain, noted the terrain, and positioned his troops with precision. The Macedonian phalanx, long spears bristling, formed the center, with cavalry on the flanks. Alexander himself took command of the right wing, leading the companion cavalry. His strategy relied on speed, flexibility, and the audacity to strike at the Persian command. The plan was not to fight the Persians head-on in a drawn-out clash, but to use concentrated force at the decisive point, the center, where Darius himself commanded. The battle began with Darius's chariots, intended to break the Macedonian lines. Horses, spiked wheels, and chargers thundered toward the phalanx. Alexander's soldiers, trained for such maneuvers, opened gaps and allowed the chariots to pass, only to disable them as they emerged, turning the weapon against the enemy. Meanwhile, the Persian cavalry on the flanks engaged Alexander's troops, seeking to encircle the smaller army. It was chaos, noise, and movement, with the dust of battle rising like fog across the plain. Alexander, as always, placed himself at the heart of danger. Leading a direct charge toward Darius, he exploited a gap in the Persian line. The Macedonian cavalry, following their king with disciplined fury, punched through the enemy formation. In the center, Darius saw his army faltering, his flanks bending, and his command threatened. Fear took hold. Reports suggest that the king, confronted with Alexander and sensing the collapse of his lines, fled once more, abandoning the battlefield. The effect on the Persian army was immediate. With the king gone, cohesion disintegrated. Soldiers fled, formations collapsed, and the Macedonians pursued relentlessly. Thousands of Persian soldiers were cut down. The plain became littered with the fallen. Unlike Issus, where Darius had escaped to fight another day, the magnitude of defeat at Gaugamela left Persia vulnerable in ways that would never fully recover. Alexander's victory was not only tactical but psychological. By defeating the Persian king in a direct confrontation on open terrain, he proved that numerical advantage and empire-spanning armies could be overcome with discipline, strategy, and audacity. His men were invigorated, their confidence became unstoppable. Yet, as always, Alexander tempered victory with pragmatism. He treated captives with care when politically advantageous, seeking to maintain the loyalty of newly conquered territories. The aftermath of Gaugamela marked a turning point in world history. Within months, major Persian cities fell to Alexander's forces. Babylon surrendered without a fight, impressed by his reputation and seeking stability. Susa, Persepolis, and eventually the heartland of Persia came under his control. The wealth of the Persian Empire, gold, silver, treasures, and archives of knowledge now passed into Macedonian hands. Alexander was no longer a conqueror moving through foreign lands. He was the ruler of one of the largest and richest empires the world had ever seen. Yet victory did not erase challenges. Governing a land of such diversity required diplomacy, strategy, and sometimes ruthlessness. Alexander installed loyal satraps, allowed local rulers to maintain some authority, and embraced cultural practices where useful. He married Persian nobility to strengthen alliances, encouraged the fusion of Greek and Persian customs, and even adopted Persian dress for ceremonial occasions. His empire was not just built on the battlefield, it was held together by the careful integration of people, culture, and loyalty. Gaugamela also illustrates something essential about Alexander's leadership. He combined personal courage with a strategic mind. He was always at the front, inspiring troops, but he also understood terrain, enemy psychology, and timing. He anticipated movements, exploited weaknesses, and maintained flexibility in the face of chaos. The victory was as much the result of intellect as it was of valor, and yet the shadow of mortality and uncertainty remained. Even with Persia under his control, the empire was immense and fragile. Communication across vast distances was slow, rebellions could erupt at any moment, and the loyalty of newly conquered peoples was never guaranteed. Alexander had achieved what few could dream, but his work as ruler had only begun. The question now became not just how to conquer, but how to govern, integrate, and maintain an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the eastern deserts. Alexander had turned the tide of history. The Macedonian king who once fought in Greece, who crushed Thebes and Tyre, who had been crowned pharaoh in Egypt, had now defeated the Persian king on a plain that would become legendary. He held the wealth and resources of Persia, the loyalty of his men, and the aura of destiny that followed him like a shadow. Yet as the sun set over the plains of Gaugamela, the question lingered. Could a man, even one as brilliant and fearless as Alexander, truly rule such a vast and diverse empire? Or would the very scale of his victories become the seed of future challenges? After the thunder of Gaugamela, the vast lands of Persia lay open before Alexander. The defeat of Darius III had shattered the cohesion of the Persian army, and key cities now faced him without resistance. From Babylon to Susa, the cities surrendered one by one, recognizing the inevitability of Macedonian rule. Imagine walking through streets where, only months ago, the banners of Persia had flown in defiance, and now the gold and silver of the empire were in the hands of a young king from Macedonia. Alexander moved methodically, not merely to plunder, but to consolidate. In Babylon, one of the richest and most sophisticated cities of the ancient world, he was welcomed as a liberator. The citizens had long chafed under Persian satraps who demanded tribute and enforced foreign customs. Alexander's reputation for respecting local traditions, coupled with his careful administration, won him acceptance. He performed sacrifices, observed local religious practices, and allowed the continuation of traditional governance alongside his appointed administrators. From Babylon, Alexander pressed east towards Susa, the treasury city of Persia. Here lay vast stores of wealth, gold, silver, precious stones, and the archives of an empire. For a commander, this was not mere spoils, it was power. With resources secured, Alexander could pay his troops, finance campaigns, and reward loyalty. He also used these resources strategically, distributing wealth to Macedonian soldiers to maintain morale while gaining the allegiance of local elites through gifts and positions of authority. Yet the symbolic heart of Persia remained. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital. The city was a marvel, a testament to the Achaemenid dynasty's power, with palaces of carved stone, columns adorned with reliefs of kings and subjects, and halls where Darius and his predecessors had held court. For Alexander, Persepolis was more than a city. It was the embodiment of Persian authority, culture, and history. To capture it was to demonstrate unequivocally that the old order had ended, and a new era had begun. The siege of Persepolis, however, was less a matter of battlefield tactics and more a display of calculated strategy. The city's defenses were formidable, but Alexander approached with cunning rather than brute force. While some of his men urged immediate assault, he moved carefully, negotiating where possible and using psychological pressure to weaken resistance. Eventually, the Macedonians entered the city, facing only minimal opposition. Once inside, Alexander allowed his men to plunder the treasury, yet he preserved the architectural and cultural treasures as symbols of conquest rather than destroying the city outright. The turning point came during a banquet, a moment of revelry and perhaps impulse. Accounts differ on the reasons, but in a night of drunken celebration, Alexander ordered Persepolis burned. Ancient sources suggest he intended the act as revenge for the Persian burning of the Acropolis in Athens decades earlier, while others imply it was a symbolic gesture. The old empire would not stand, its power transformed into memory and legend. Whatever the motive, the fire consumed palaces, halls, and archives, leaving Persepolis a smouldering reminder of imperial fragility and the costs of rebellion. While the city burned, Alexander did not linger. His vision extended far beyond Persia's western lands. The empire he now controlled was vast, and the eastern provinces, the lands that stretched toward the Indus River, were largely unconquered. Beyond the mountains and deserts lay kingdoms unknown to most of his soldiers, with peoples whose language, customs, and terrain were unfamiliar. Yet Alexander's ambition would not allow pause. He began planning the next great expedition, a campaign into India, a land of rivers, jungles, and formidable armies. Preparation for India required careful logistics. Alexander's army, though seasoned, needed new supplies, reinforcements, and specialized equipment. Horses had to be rested and fed. Soldiers had to acclimate to harsher climates. Engineers had to plan for river crossings, sieges, and the unpredictable conditions of the subcontinent. The Macedonians had faced deserts, mountains, and fortified cities, but the jungles of India presented entirely different challenges. Monsoons, dense forests, unfamiliar diseases, and elephants trained for war. Alexander understood that victory would demand more than courage. It would require adaptability and meticulous planning. As he organized the army, Alexander also sought to integrate his new subjects. Across the former Persian territories, he installed loyal governors, encouraged the blending of Greek and Persian customs, and even adopted some Persian dress and ceremonial practices. He married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, in a strategic union designed to legitimize his claim to the Persian throne. By uniting the Macedonian and Persian elites, he hoped to stabilize the vast territories while projecting an image of continuity and legitimacy, rather than merely conquest and replacement. Alexander's consolidation of Persia also revealed his diplomatic acumen. In regions where rebellion threatened, he combined military force with negotiation. Cities that resisted were punished decisively, while those that submitted were allowed autonomy under Macedonian oversight. The balance between coercion and persuasion was delicate, yet Alexander understood that empire depended not solely on fear, but on loyalty and legitimacy. His approach would be tested repeatedly as he moved east, where local rulers and warrior cultures would challenge his authority in ways unfamiliar to Macedonia. Despite the challenges, Alexander pressed forward. The march toward India was not merely a military expedition, it was a journey into the unknown. Soldiers marched through deserts that tested endurance, over mountains that scraped the sky, and across rivers that seemed insurmountable. Every day brought new hardships: scarcity of water, extreme temperatures, and the constant threat of ambush or rebellion. Yet the Macedonian army followed, driven by the charisma, courage, and reputation of their king. Alexander's presence at the front, leading charges and sharing hardships, reinforced loyalty and inspired extraordinary feats of endurance. By the time the army approached the borders of India, the Macedonians had traveled thousands of miles from their homes in Europe. They had crossed seas and rivers, deserts and mountains, facing armies, fortresses, and the unpredictable forces of nature. Their loyalty, hardened by shared trials, was as vital to Alexander's strategy as any sword or phalanx. And yet, even in this moment of achievement, uncertainty lingered. The lands beyond the Hindu Kush were mysterious, the peoples fierce, and the terrain unforgiving. Victory was not guaranteed, and each step forward was a testament to human resilience, leadership, and ambition. Alexander's consolidation of Persia, the capture and symbolic destruction of Persepolis, and the preparations for India reveal the dual nature of his genius. He was both warrior and administrator, conqueror and statesman, visionary and pragmatist. He understood that an empire was not built on battles alone, but on culture, diplomacy, integration, and strategic planning. At every step, he combined audacity with foresight, ensuring that each conquest reinforced the next. As you imagine the Macedonian army resting along the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris, preparing for the next great challenge, one cannot help but reflect on the enormity of what they had achieved. They had followed a young king across continents, through deserts, mountains, and rivers, against enemies that had once seemed invincible. They had witnessed the fall of empires, the burning of cities, and the assertion of divine kingship. And yet, the greatest challenges lay ahead, in lands even more distant, with peoples even more formidable. The question lingers: could a single man, even one as brilliant and determined as Alexander, truly command such vast and diverse territories? Could ambition, courage, and vision alone sustain an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus? Or was this a story of human striving against impossible odds, destined to inspire awe and reflection for centuries to come? After years of relentless conquest, Alexander turned his eyes toward lands few Macedonians had ever imagined: the kingdoms beyond the mountains, the jungles, and rivers of India. The campaign eastward was no mere extension of previous battles. It represented a journey into the unknown, a confrontation with terrain, cultures, and armies unlike any he had encountered before. His men, hardened by years of war, now faced challenges that would test both physical endurance and psychological resolve. The first major obstacle was the Hindu Kush Mountains, a formidable barrier separating the plains of Persia from the Indus River Valley. These peaks rose jagged and frozen, their passes narrow, treacherous, and susceptible to avalanches. The path forward was not a road but a gauntlet of stone and ice, where a single misstep could cost a soldier his life. Yet Alexander pressed forward, determined to bring the Macedonian army into India. The march was slow, meticulous, and exhausting. Soldiers carried supplies over narrow ledges, guided animals through mountain passes, and endured snow and freezing winds. Every day demanded endurance, courage, and constant vigilance. Beyond the mountains, the terrain shifted dramatically. The plains of the Indus and the monsoon-fed rivers created a vastly different environment. Here, vegetation was dense, rivers unpredictable, and the climate oppressive. Local kingdoms were not passive. They were fiercely independent, well adapted to their environment, and capable of fielding armies with unique tactics. Elephants, armored and terrifying, carried warriors into battle and could break infantry lines in ways unknown to the Macedonians. Rivers were deep and swift, requiring ingenious engineering to cross. Every step east presented new logistical challenges that demanded Alexander's attention and ingenuity. The most significant engagement came along the banks of the Hydaspes River, where Alexander faced King Porus, a local ruler renowned for his courage, skill, and the formidable war elephants under his command. Ancient sources describe Porus as a king of imposing stature, both physically and strategically, who had united local forces to resist the Macedonian advance. Unlike previous campaigns, Alexander could not rely solely on speed, flanking maneuvers, or the phalanx. The battle demanded adaptation, discipline, and the clever use of terrain. Alexander's strategy was patient and calculated. He first conducted thorough reconnaissance, understanding the river's width, flow, and depth, and identifying possible crossing points. The goal was not to rush the enemy, but to strike decisively at the right moment. His engineers constructed rafts, bridges, and pontoons, allowing parts of the army to cross under the cover of night. Noise and feints were employed to distract Porus and mask the main thrust of the attack. This was a masterclass in logistics, deception, and timing hallmarks of Alexander's military genius. When the battle began, the Macedonians faced the full might of Porus's army. Infantry, cavalry, and elephants moved in coordination, presenting a terrifying wall of force. The elephants, in particular, were formidable. Their size, armor, and training made them living battering rams. Yet, Alexander's troops, disciplined and trained for years in the Macedonian phalanx, adapted. Spears were angled to unseat riders, gaps were created to funnel elephants into kill zones, and cavalry struck at the flanks. Alexander himself led charges with his companion cavalry, exploiting weaknesses and maintaining morale under conditions that would have tested the bravest warriors. The battle raged with intensity and unpredictability. Elephants stampeded, soldiers fell, and rivers became obstacles as well as avenues for tactical maneuvers. Yet the discipline and coordination of the Macedonian army eventually prevailed. Alexander's ability to inspire courage in his men, combined with clever tactics, turned the tide. Porus, though defeated, survived and impressed Alexander with his valor. In a gesture that shocked many of his contemporaries, Alexander reinstated Porus as a satrap, allowing him to continue ruling his kingdom under Macedonian oversight. This decision highlighted Alexander's pragmatism. Loyalty and local cooperation could achieve more than total destruction. The victory at Hydaspes was costly but significant. Alexander had not only overcome unfamiliar terrain and an unconventional enemy, but he had also proven the adaptability of his army. The campaign showcased the importance of reconnaissance, engineering, and psychological warfare, in addition to battlefield courage. Macedonian soldiers, accustomed to fighting in deserts, mountains, and open plains, had now faced monsoon rivers, dense vegetation, and armored elephants, and emerged victorious. After the battle, Alexander pushed further into India, encountering new kingdoms, rivers, and tribal confederations. Each engagement required adaptation. River crossings, jungle warfare, and diplomacy with local rulers became daily concerns. Yet even as he pressed forward, the limits of his army's endurance became apparent. Soldiers, who had marched thousands of miles from Macedonia, were weary. Morale was strained by heat, monsoons, and the continuous uncertainty of unfamiliar lands. Despite Alexander's charisma and leadership, fatigue and homesickness began to weigh heavily on his men. At the Hydaspes River, the easternmost point of his campaign, his army refused to march further. Months of continuous campaigning, fighting, and harsh conditions had worn them down. Alexander, ever ambitious, was confronted with the limits of human endurance. He listened to his generals, weighed the morale of his troops, and made the pragmatic decision to turn back. This moment, though marked by restraint, demonstrates the balance Alexander often struck between ambition and reality. Even a man who seemed unstoppable had to respect the limits of those who followed him. The return journey through the harsh terrain of the Gedrosian desert tested the army once more. Shortages of water, extreme heat, and difficult passages resulted in significant losses, highlighting the human cost of conquest. Yet Alexander's leadership remained crucial. His presence, encouragement, and strategic acumen prevented the expedition from total disaster. The journey back reinforced lessons of resilience, adaptation, and the interplay between human endurance and leadership in sustaining an empire. Alexander's campaign in India illustrates the expansion of his vision beyond mere conquest. He integrated local rulers, adopted some cultural practices, and encouraged the spread of Hellenistic influence while respecting existing traditions. Cities were founded along rivers and trade routes, linking distant regions to the broader Macedonian world. The blending of cultures, alongside military success, exemplifies the dual nature of Alexander's genius. He was both a conqueror and a visionary statesman, shaping not only territories but the cultural landscape of an entire region. The legacy of the Indian campaign endured long after Alexander's return westward. His soldiers brought back accounts of vast rivers, jungles, and the strange and powerful war elephants. Knowledge of geography, trade routes, and local kingdoms expanded dramatically. The campaign reinforced the reputation of Alexander as a leader capable of operating in any terrain, against any enemy, and under the most challenging circumstances. It also emphasized the interplay between ambition, strategy, and human resilience, key themes in the story of his empire. As the army turned westward, retracing paths through deserts and mountains, Alexander's thoughts likely shifted toward consolidation, governance, and the future of the empire he had built. India had tested the limits of his forces, revealed new challenges, and confirmed his ability to inspire loyalty under extreme conditions. Yet it also offered a reminder: even the greatest ambition must contend with human limits. For all his audacity, Alexander's empire would ultimately depend not only on military genius, but also on leadership, culture, and the careful integration of diverse peoples. The campaign in India raises profound questions about leadership, endurance, and ambition. How does a single man lead tens of thousands across continents, through terrain both familiar and alien? How does a commander maintain morale, inspire loyalty, and integrate diverse cultures while pursuing expansion? And, ultimately, what does it mean to push the boundaries of human capability, knowing that limits exist even for the greatest of leaders? After the thunderous victories along the banks of the Hydaspes and months of campaigning through India, Alexander and his army faced perhaps their greatest test, yet not an enemy, but the vast, punishing expanse of the Gedrosian desert. The army, weary and battle-worn, now confronted a landscape that demanded endurance beyond anything they had previously experienced. This journey would become a legend, not only for its hardships, but also for the leadership, resilience, and human limits it revealed. The Gedrosian Desert, located in what is now southern Iran and Pakistan, was known to locals for its harsh climate, scarce water, and treacherous terrain. The sun scorched the earth, daytime temperatures climbed to unbearable heights, and sandstorms could appear without warning, obliterating visibility and disorienting travelers. Supplies were minimal, wells and springs were few and often unreliable. For an army accustomed to the more temperate conditions of Macedonia, Persia, and even the rivers of India, this desert was an entirely new challenge. Alexander's decision to march through the Gedrosian Desert remains a topic of debate among historians. Some suggest it was an attempt to replicate the hardships of Persian kings who had failed to conquer the region, a demonstration of his ability to endure as much as to conquer. Others argue that it was a practical route to unify his eastern territories before returning west. Whatever the reason, the desert tested the discipline, endurance, and morale of his men to unprecedented limits. From the outset, conditions were dire. Water ran low quickly, and food supplies dwindled under the relentless sun. Soldiers marched for hours on end, carrying heavy armor, weapons, and provisions, only to rest on scorched earth at night. Some men, weakened by hunger and heat, collapsed and never rose again. Camels and pack animals succumbed to exhaustion, leaving soldiers to carry additional burdens. Every mile was an exercise in survival. Every day, a battle against the elements rather than a human adversary. Alexander himself endured the same hardships, sharing the suffering of his troops. He rode alongside them, inspected supply lines, and motivated the army through speeches and example. His presence was crucial. Morale would have collapsed without his leadership. Ancient accounts suggest he even rationed his own water, eating the same meager meals as his men, demonstrating that survival and solidarity were as important to leadership as strategy or courage on the battlefield. Despite careful planning, the desert exacted a terrible toll. Estimates suggest that as many as 12,000 men perished during the march. The losses were not due to combat, but to heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Soldiers died quietly, their bodies swallowed by the sands, leaving little trace. For those who survived, the experience forged extraordinary resilience and loyalty, tempered by the shared ordeal. The desert became a crucible in which the human spirit was tested as much as the army itself. Navigation presented additional challenges. Without landmarks and with shifting sands obscuring paths, Alexander relied on scouts, local guides, and celestial observations. Errors could mean days of wandering, exposure to dehydration, and further casualties. Ancient sources recount moments when the army nearly lost its way, forced to backtrack under punishing sun and without adequate water. Each successful navigation was a testament to leadership, discipline, and the skill of his officers. Emerging from the desert into more hospitable regions, the army faced the task of consolidating control over eastern territories. Many regions, though technically subdued, had been only loosely integrated into Alexander's empire. Local populations were diverse, ranging from nomadic tribes to established cities with deep-rooted traditions. Alexander's challenge was to maintain loyalty, secure governance, and prevent uprisings, all while preparing for the march westward toward Persia and the Mediterranean. Alexander's approach to consolidation combined pragmatism with strategic foresight. He appointed loyal satraps, often blending Macedonian officers with local administrators, ensuring both oversight and local representation. In regions recently conquered, he encouraged cultural integration by respecting customs, religious practices, and governance structures. Yet he remained unflinching against rebellion, using both military force and strategic diplomacy to maintain order. His policies reflected a sophisticated understanding. Empire was as much about administration and legitimacy as it was about conquest. One striking example of Alexander's strategy was the integration of local elites. In areas where resistance had been strongest, he incorporated defeated rulers and nobles into his administration. This approach transformed potential adversaries into allies, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and fostering loyalty. By combining respect, reward, and, when necessary, coercion, Alexander reinforced the stability of territories far from his Macedonian homeland. The consolidation process also required attention to logistics, trade, and infrastructure. Cities along key rivers, roads, and mountain passes were fortified and connected to broader supply networks. These measures ensured that armies could be reinforced, commerce could flourish, and communication across vast distances remained possible. Alexander's vision extended beyond mere conquest. He sought to weave together a vast, interconnected empire capable of sustaining itself over time. Despite his careful planning, challenges persisted. Rebellions erupted in remote regions, often fueled by dissatisfaction with foreign oversight, harsh taxation, or cultural differences. Alexander responded with a combination of force and negotiation, balancing deterrence with conciliation. His methods varied according to the circumstances. Cities that submitted peacefully were spared, while those that resisted faced strict punishment. This adaptability ensured the loyalty of diverse populations and prevented the kind of instability that had undermined previous empires. The return from India and the march through the Gedrosian desert also revealed another aspect of Alexander's leadership: his attention to morale and psychological well-being. He understood that soldiers who had faced extreme hardship required reassurance, recognition, and reward. Generous distributions of pay, honors, and land were used strategically to maintain loyalty. Public ceremonies, feasts, and displays of triumph reinforced the army's sense of purpose and accomplishment, reminding them that their suffering had achieved something extraordinary. Emerging from the desert into more fertile lands, Alexander and his army could reflect on the journey. The hardships of the Gedrosian desert were a microcosm of the challenges of empire. Leadership, endurance, logistics, and human resilience were tested daily. Soldiers had survived extreme heat, dehydration, exhaustion, and uncertainty, demonstrating extraordinary commitment to their king and to the vision of conquest. These experiences forged bonds between men and reinforced the authority of Alexander in ways that victories in battle alone could not achieve. In consolidating his eastern territories, Alexander also laid the foundation for cultural and economic integration. Cities were established or expanded, trade routes secured, and Hellenistic influence encouraged alongside local traditions. This blending of cultures would shape the regions for centuries, leaving a legacy that endured long after the death of Alexander. His empire was not merely a collection of conquered lands, it was a dynamic network of peoples, economies, and ideas bound together by governance, diplomacy, and shared experience. The return from India and the consolidation of eastern provinces underscore a profound lesson about leadership and human resilience. Conquest is not only about victory on the battlefield, it is about endurance in the face of natural and human challenges, about understanding and integrating diverse cultures, and about balancing ambition with pragmatism. Alexander's success in this phase of his campaign demonstrates the interplay between vision, strategy, and the limits of human capability. As the army finally regrouped and replenished its strength, Alexander's focus shifted westward. The Mediterranean and the heart of his empire awaited, along with new challenges in governance, succession, and diplomacy. The eastern campaigns had tested him, his army, and his administrative skills in ways unprecedented in history. Yet Alexander's vision remained unbounded. His goal was not merely to conquer lands, but to create an empire that could endure, unite diverse peoples, and leave a lasting mark on civilization. Even now, as you imagine the weary Macedonian soldiers emerging from the Gedrosian desert, one cannot help but reflect on the extraordinary human capacity for endurance, adaptability, and loyalty. The march through the desert and the consolidation of eastern territories illustrate that the story of Alexander is not solely about battles won or cities taken. It is also about leadership under extreme conditions, the integration of cultures, and the resilience of ordinary men following an extraordinary king. The question lingers: could any other army, in any other age, have endured what Alexander's forces did, and emerged not only victorious, but organized, cohesive, and inspired. And in the grand sweep of history is endurance itself, as remarkable a measure of greatness as victory in battle. After years of relentless campaigning, spanning continents, deserts, rivers, and mountains, Alexander returned to the heart of his empire. Babylon, a city of extraordinary wealth, culture, and history, became the focal point of his final years. Here, Alexander's ambition shifted from conquest to consolidation, governance, and the creation of a lasting legacy. The victories over Persia, the campaigns through India, and the perilous march through the Gedrosian desert had brought him immense power, yet they had also revealed the fragility of human life, the limits of endurance, and the delicate balance required to maintain such a vast empire. Babylon, with its monumental walls, hanging gardens, and bustling markets, offered a city capable of housing the administrative heart of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus. Alexander invested heavily in the city's infrastructure, expanding roads, fortifications, and waterworks. Palaces were built or renovated to accommodate his growing court, while administrative buildings centralized governance over the diverse territories. The Macedonian king understood that controlling an empire of such scale required more than military might. It demanded a network of communication, logistics, and cultural integration. During these years, Alexander also focused on the founding of cities. Perhaps more than any ruler before him, he understood the strategic and cultural value of urban centers. Cities served as administrative hubs, military garrisons, trade centers, and instruments of Hellenistic influence. Alexandria in Egypt had already demonstrated the potential of such cities, and now, throughout the eastern provinces, Alexander established numerous settlements. Each city bore his name, linking them to his legacy and promoting Greek culture alongside local traditions. These urban centers became enduring symbols of Macedonian conquest and integration, many of which thrived long after his death. Yet, even amidst planning and construction, Alexander's focus was not limited to bricks and roads. He was acutely aware of the fragility of his empire, which stretched across thousands of miles and encompassed countless peoples, languages, and cultures. To unify this diversity, he encouraged the blending of Greek and local customs. Marriages between Macedonian officers and local nobility were arranged, religious practices were respected, and administrative positions were shared with local leaders. This approach, pragmatic and strategic, sought to weave the empire into a cohesive political and cultural fabric, rather than relying solely on fear or military enforcement. Alexander's personal life was also intertwined with these political strategies. He had married multiple times, often for both personal and political reasons. Statira, the daughter of Darius III, symbolized the union of Macedonian and Persian lines. Roxana, a princess from Bactria, represented alliances in the eastern provinces. These marriages reinforced his legitimacy, strengthened alliances, and integrated conquered elites into his vision of a unified empire. Alexander's understanding of power extended beyond armies and battles. It encompassed family, culture, and symbolism. Despite his achievements, Alexander's final years were marked by increasing strain. The physical and psychological toll of years of campaigning, combined with the constant challenges of governance, began to manifest. Reports suggest that he worked tirelessly, often ignoring his own health, while dealing with political tensions, logistical challenges, and the integration of newly conquered territories. The immense scale of his responsibilities required constant attention, and few rulers in history had faced such a combination of military, administrative, and diplomatic demands. In Babylon, Alexander's court became a microcosm of the empire. Macedonian generals, Persian nobles, and administrators from distant provinces interacted daily. While many were loyal, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Ambitions, rivalries, and cultural differences created friction, which Alexander had to navigate carefully. Maintaining authority required not just force, but negotiation, insight, and charisma. His ability to balance these pressures demonstrated that leadership of an empire relied as much on political skill as it did on battlefield genius. Alexander also engaged in campaigns of exploration, sending troops and envoys to map rivers, mountains, and distant lands. He sought knowledge, science, and understanding alongside conquest. Accounts describe him studying the Nile's flow, the behavior of rivers in India, and the customs of far-flung peoples. This thirst for knowledge reflected a vision of empire that was both expansive and intellectual. He did not simply conquer lands, but sought to understand, integrate, and shape them in a way that would endure. Yet, even as he consolidated power, challenges emerged. Revolts in the eastern provinces tested the limits of his control. Local leaders occasionally resisted Macedonian authority, and some cities rebelled despite his administrative measures. Alexander responded with a combination of force, diplomacy, and integration. By striking decisively against open rebellion while offering loyalty, land, and status to compliant leaders, he reinforced his authority while minimizing unrest. His methods were both strategic and pragmatic, blending military might with political intelligence. The final years also revealed Alexander's increasing reliance on symbolic acts to reinforce his authority. He encouraged worship of himself as a divine figure, linking his identity to gods such as Zeus Ammon. Statues, inscriptions, and ceremonies reinforced this divine association, strengthening loyalty among subjects and soldiers alike. Alexander's charisma, martial prowess, and self-presentation as both king and deity created a powerful psychological bond with those around him. Yet this emphasis on divinity also introduced tensions, particularly among Macedonian generals who were accustomed to traditional forms of loyalty and hierarchy. By 323 before the Common Era, Alexander's health began to decline. Accounts of his final days suggest that he fell ill in Babylon, experiencing fever, pain, and exhaustion. Despite the efforts of physicians, his condition worsened. Surrounded by generals, officials, and friends, he reportedly remained engaged, discussing governance, succession, and the future of his empire. His death, at the age of 32, left the vast territories he had conquered without a clear successor. The suddenness of his passing plunged the empire into uncertainty, triggering rivalries and the eventual fragmentation of the territories he had unified. Alexander's death in Babylon marks the end of an era in which one man had reshaped the known world. From Greece to Egypt, Persia, and the Indus Valley, his campaigns had transformed landscapes, cultures, and politics. Cities founded under his direction became centers of Hellenistic influence, trade, and learning. Military tactics and strategies developed under his leadership influenced generations of commanders. Yet, even as an empire was left in flux, the legacy of his vision endured. His campaigns demonstrated not only the possibilities of human ambition and leadership, but also the fragility of empire and the limits of mortal endurance. In reflecting on these final years, one is struck by the duality of Alexander's genius. He was at once a conqueror and a statesman, a visionary and a pragmatist, a man capable of both immense daring and careful administration. His achievements were extraordinary, yet they came at immense cost, to his soldiers, to local populations, and ultimately to himself. The combination of relentless ambition, strategic brilliance, and physical and mental strain illustrates the extraordinary human dimension behind historical legend. The story of Alexander's final years in Babylon invites reflection on the nature of power, ambition, and legacy. How does a single individual maintain control over lands spanning thousands of miles, encompassing countless cultures, languages, and traditions? How do leadership, endurance, and vision interact to create an empire that outlasts the mortal life of its founder? And ultimately, what does it mean to build a legacy in which cities, cultures, and human endeavor are transformed across continents? As you imagine the streets of Babylon, the palaces Alexander built, the cities he founded, and the soldiers who had marched with him across deserts, mountains, and rivers, it becomes clear that his life was more than a story of conquest. It was a narrative of vision, resilience, adaptation, and human striving. Alexander's final years, marked by consolidation, administration, and reflection, reveal that the work of empire is as much about governance, culture, and integration as it is about the glory of battle. Even in death, Alexander's influence did not fade. His generals divided the empire, founding dynasties that ruled in Egypt, Persia, and beyond. The cities he established became enduring centers of culture and commerce. The integration of Greek and local customs spread Hellenistic influence across continents. And the story of a young Macedonian king who conquered the known world and pressed into lands beyond imagination continues to captivate, inspire, and provoke reflection. The question remains, could anyone truly hold such an empire together after his death? Or was the scale of his ambition destined to outstrip the capacity of even the most capable successors? And in the vast sweep of history, is it the victories, the cities, or the vision that endures longest, the tangible monuments of conquest, or the human stories of endurance, leadership, and imagination that shaped the world? The sudden death of Alexander in Babylon, at the age of 32, sent shockwaves across the empire he had built. From the Mediterranean to the Indus, vast territories that had been unified under a single audacious vision suddenly faced uncertainty. His generals, loyal soldiers, and administrators were confronted with an impossible question. Who would inherit the legacy of a man whose ambition had reshaped the known world? The answer, it turned out, would not be simple, and the resulting fragmentation would define the centuries that followed. Alexander left no clear heir capable of ruling the entirety of his empire. His only son, Alexander IV, was born posthumously, and even his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, was considered mentally unfit to govern independently. This absence of a decisive successor created a power vacuum, and the Macedonian generals known as the Diadochi, or successors, immediately moved to stake their claims. These men were seasoned warriors, administrators, and politicians, each with their own ambitions, loyalties, and strategies for controlling regions of the vast empire. The initial response to Alexander's death was a mixture of grief, uncertainty, and opportunism. Across the empire, cities and provinces sought to determine which faction would govern them. Some regions, loyal to the memory of Alexander, remained orderly and deferred to local satraps aligned with Macedonian generals. Others seized the moment to assert independence, sometimes violently. Communication across such vast distances was slow, often delayed by weeks or months, leaving local leaders to make decisions in isolation, with incomplete information about the power struggles unfolding in Babylon. One of the earliest and most consequential decisions was made by Perdiccas, one of Alexander's most trusted generals. Perdiccas attempted to act as regent for the infant Alexander IV, consolidating authority in Babylon. However, other generals resisted, each claiming territory and asserting autonomy. Ptolemy, for instance, seized control of Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would endure for centuries. Seleucus moved to dominate Mesopotamia and Persia, while Antigonus claimed large portions of Asia Minor. The once unified empire was rapidly divided, not along cultural lines but along the ambitions of powerful individuals, each seeking to maintain control over troops, territories, and resources. This fragmentation, though chaotic, did not erase the influence of Alexander's campaigns. The cities he had founded, from Alexandria in Egypt to those scattered across Persia and beyond, remained centers of Hellenistic culture, trade, and administration. Greek language, architecture, and governance structures spread alongside local customs, creating a cultural synthesis that endured long after Macedonian political control waned. The Hellenistic world, shaped in part by Alexander's conquests, became a bridge between East and West, influencing trade, philosophy, and science for centuries. The wars of the Diadochi, which ensued in the decades following Alexander's death, were brutal and protracted. Alliances shifted frequently, battles erupted over key cities and territories, and entire armies were destroyed in the struggle for dominance. Macedonia, Persia, Egypt, and parts of India saw rulers rise and fall, often violently. Yet, despite the bloodshed, the administrative and cultural structures Alexander had established provided a framework that allowed these successor states to maintain relative stability and continuity. His influence persisted, not through direct control, but through the systems, cities, and ideas he had left behind. In the western provinces, Macedonia remained the seat of political power, though it was no longer able to command the far-flung territories of the east directly. The Diadochi carved out kingdoms, each maintaining armies, fortresses, and trade routes. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy I, became a particularly enduring example, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions and establishing Alexandria as a hub of learning, commerce, and culture. Similarly, Seleucid rule over Persia and Mesopotamia facilitated trade and the spread of Hellenistic culture deep into Asia. The eastern provinces, particularly those near the Indus, were more difficult to control. Local rulers, long accustomed to independence, resisted Macedonian authority once Alexander's presence was removed. Revolts, skirmishes, and the reassertion of indigenous power became common. While Macedonian garrisons and officials remained, the vast distances and local resistance meant that central control was limited. In these regions, the influence of Hellenistic culture was more subtle, often manifesting through cities, trade, and intermarriage, rather than direct political rule. Beyond politics and administration, Alexander's campaigns left a profound impact on the intellectual and cultural landscape. Knowledge of geography, astronomy, botany, and engineering expanded dramatically as a result of his explorations. Accounts of distant rivers, mountains, and societies brought new perspectives to the Mediterranean world. Greek scholars and scientists traveled with the army or settled in newly founded cities documenting flora, fauna, customs, and technologies. The legacy of these studies contributed to the development of science, cartography, and historical understanding for generations. Trade and economic integration were also enduring consequences of Alexander's conquests. Routes connecting the Mediterranean to Persia, India, and beyond facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Merchants, artisans, and scholars moved along these corridors, establishing networks that persisted despite political fragmentation. Cities founded by Alexander became nodes of economic activity, ensuring that commerce and communication continued even as the political landscape shifted. The empire he built may have fractured, but the infrastructure and networks he left behind persisted, shaping regional economies for centuries. The human cost of Alexander's campaigns, however, was immense. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians had perished in battles, sieges, and marches across deserts and mountains. Cities had been burned, populations displaced, and cultures disrupted. Yet these sacrifices were inseparable from the empire's creation. The stories of endurance, courage, and survival became part of the collective memory of the regions he had touched. Soldiers who had marched from Macedonia to India carried tales of heroism, hardship, and loyalty, preserving the human dimension of Alexander's conquest for posterity. In reflecting on the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death, one sees the complex interplay of ambition, human capability, and historical contingency. His empire, immense and unprecedented, could not be held together by force alone. Political fragmentation was inevitable, yet the structures he had established, cities, trade routes, administrative systems, and cultural integration ensured that his influence endured long beyond the lifespan of any single ruler. The balance between ambition, vision, and human limitation becomes clear. Even the greatest achievements are constrained by mortality, distance, and the unpredictable forces of history. Alexander's enduring legacy is multifaceted. Militarily, he demonstrated the power of strategy, discipline, and innovation, creating tactics and formations that influenced commanders for centuries. Politically, he pioneered approaches to governance that combined local autonomy with centralized oversight, blending cultures and traditions in ways that fostered stability and loyalty. Culturally, He spread Greek language, art, architecture, and philosophy across continents, establishing the foundations of the Hellenistic world. And personally, he became a symbol of human ambition, courage, and vision, inspiring generations to imagine the possibilities of leadership and conquest. The story of Alexander, concluding with his death and the fragmentation of his empire, reminds us that even the greatest achievements are subject to the forces of history. Empires rise and fall, territories shift, and human lives are shaped by the ambitions of extraordinary individuals. Yet the imprint of vision, courage, and innovation endures, leaving a legacy that informs the world long after the final battle is fought and the conqueror has passed. As you imagine the cities Alexander founded, the soldiers who marched thousands of miles, and the landscapes transformed by his campaigns, it becomes clear that history is not only about events, but about human resilience, adaptation, and the enduring consequences of ambition. The fragmentation of his empire does not diminish his achievements. Rather, it underscores the complexity of empire, the challenge of governance, and the remarkable vision required to unite continents under a single banner. The question lingers: how much of Alexander's legacy is defined by the lands he conquered, and how much by the systems, cities, and cultural synthesis he left behind? And as we reflect on his life, campaigns, and the immediate aftermath of his death, we are reminded that history is both fragile and enduring, shaped by human endeavor, ambition, and the relentless passage of time.